Welcome to the Cut for Time podcast here at the Canton United Methodist Church. My name is Pastor Clay. I'm joined by Eric Stearns, and we're digging into my message from Sunday, which was interesting for lots of reasons. Sunday was one of those Sundays where we did everything we don't know how to do because we celebrated All Saints Sunday, we celebrated a baptism, we celebrated communion, and we also had time for a little bit of a sermon. And so we're going to be digging into what that process looks like when the timing of church gets crazy, and then just digging into the things that did get left behind on the cutting room floor for this week's sermon. So let's get into it.
Sounds good.
We got done with church, and Scott Richmond looked at me because Scott was running the slides back there, so he knows how long my sermon was. And he said, Pastor, you did a pretty good job of stuffing a 10-gallon sermon into a 5-gallon bucket. And I was like, thanks. I definitely got most of what I wanted. And so. Yep.
So does that just come with time? I mean, that to me, that's a real skill that you can take a sermon and on the fly be able to start hacking at it and still make it fluid, right? So What does that look like? I mean, do you have cues? Like what?
Yeah, so especially because I preach with slides, I've got my sermon up so I can actually just share my screen for the folks that are watching this via video. I work off of a manuscript. I write a manuscript. I don't have the manuscript with me in church, but the person running slides, this is what they get. They know, and so those highlighted things are my cues. I want this slide when I say that phrase. And so I will write that phrase verbatim when I want it. Scott or Teresa, whoever's running slides, knows that that's the slide that I want. And when I write my notes, I write those in a different color, so I know they're coming up, and I kind of know what's around them, and I know how to prompt the tech person into getting the slide on the screen that I want, and then and then I know what I can cut, because I'm going to continue to have tech people that want to actually do this and not feel frustrated and Clay just does whatever he wants to do. He gives us this, I don't even know why. If I want to keep them. And also, it's just good preaching because these are my anchor points of I'm going to transition to something when the slide moves. So I know what's around it that I can be I can, this is probably 4 or 5 sentences. Here's what I really want to say in those sentences, and then just cut it down from there. But because I am who I am as a person, I'm the kind of guy that will use 10 or 12 words when one will do. And Pastor Stephanie that I do sermon series with every once in a while, it drives her crazy because I'm an expander and she's a condenser. And so when I was in seminary, be okay, cool. We have a 15-page paper. I'm on page 16. Awesome. And she would be there sitting and saying, oh, we have a 15-page paper and I'm on page 9 and I'm done. I'm just done. And so we have this counter style where I can be okay, could you read this so I know what to cut? And then she can send me her stuff and she says, can you read this so I know what to expand? And so we were able to share that way. But because I know my pivot points, I know what I need in order to make the next point make sense, basically. So, and sometimes I do it successfully, and other times I re-record the sermon. I opted this week to not re-record because I think it did flow together well enough.
I thought it flowed very well, yeah.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah.
Kind of along those lines of expanding. As an engineer, we are very concise. If you don't need any extra, we're not going to put it in, right?
Sure.
I struggle writing a sermon that's any longer than 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Because you people are smart that I'm talking to. You can figure out what I don't need to say anything extra. But then I listen to you and I'm I should do more of that.
You preach a very good sermon. By the way, I know that you know that from me, but I there's a reason why I keep asking you, because you're good at it and you're consistent and you're consistently good. One of the major things that got cut is dealing with where does Boaz come from? Because I made the big connection is that Ruth's story connects to Jesus. That's the overarching thing I wanted us to see is there is a legacy of faithfulness in Ruth's lineage that goes all the way from Moab and false gods to Jesus, which is as big of a spectrum as you can imagine. Boaz's story is just as interesting, and like Boaz's lineage is just as interesting, and it just proves that the family of God is so messed up. Like Boaz being involved in this entire story when he is the son of a prostitute. Like as in Matthew's gospel, this is what really got cut on Sunday is Boaz's lineage and Boaz's heritage, because we learn in Matthew's gospel that he is the son of Rahab the prostitute. And Rahab the prostitute might sound familiar to you if you're reading through the Old Testament, because back in the Old Testament time, Rahab helped the spies that were spying on Jericho. Like we know her from the story of Scripture, and we know how important she was to Hebrew success in Jericho. And so now you have another tie into this. Like this lineage traces all the way to Jesus, and it starts because of a prostitute's son. And like when we think about the family of God and who we're supposed to be, the son of a prostitute doesn't really like raise to that level. But yet here's God working this magnificent work through Ruth, a Moabite, and who worshiped false gods growing up, because that's what you did in Moab, and Boaz, who is the son of a prostitute. Like this is the family that God was working in the midst of. Like, and then Boaz ties back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Boaz ties all the way back to the patriarchs, and so there's a heritage of faithfulness that we are now called forth to live forward. And even if we're a little bit messed up, it's okay, because the family of God has always been messed up. So that's the heart of what got cut on Sunday. Like I still made the larger point that Ruth connects to David and David connects to Jesus and Jesus connects to all of us. But there's just so much more nuance going on in that situation that I wasn't able to get to.
So should we back up and like talk about who Naomi is?
Sure. Yeah, we can totally do that.
Because I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah. So we learn in Ruth chapter 1 that there is a woman named Naomi that has moved from. And actually, it starts a couple generations earlier. It starts because of famine, and not the same famine as Joseph and Genesis 50. This is later. This is a different famine, but the family moves from their ancestral home in Bethlehem away to the area of Moab, and that's where they establish life, because there's farmland, and there's the ability to be gainfully employed, and the ability for their families to eat and thrive in actual physical health. And so Naomi marries Elimelech, who is a Moabite, and they end up having kids. They have Mahlon and Chilion, and they take wives, Ruth and Orpah, and then everybody dies. We're not really told what they died from. We're just told that everybody dies. Elimelech dies, Mahlon dies, Chilion dies, and these three women are left alone. And in that day and age, that's such a vulnerable. I mean, even in our day and age, that's a vulnerable place for someone to be. So Naomi's like, I don't really belong here at all. I only stayed because I met Elimelech and had a family, and that's that's kind of how life works now, that you find a place and establish yourself, and that's just where you stay until you lose all your ties. And what do you do then? What do you do when your world has just been completely rocked by losing your husband and both of your sons? I'd want to go home too. I'm going to move back to Bethlehem because I have family there, because I'll have support there, because I'll have care there in a way that I don't have now. And that's where it gets into Ruth and Orpah have to decide what to do. And they both say, we're going to go. And Naomi says, no, why would you do that? You are young. You belong here. You're a part of this. You are a Moabite. I'm not. We're different. I have my beliefs in God of, in Yahweh, the faith that I was taught as a child, and you don't have that. You worship the false gods of the people here. And so they have to decide what they're going to do. And Orpah listens to Naomi. Naomi said, stay. And Orpah's like, all right, cool. I can establish life again here. I'm sure we're not told this because that's the last we hear about Orpah in the Bible, but there's room to imagine that she met somebody else and had a family and did the things, because that's what Ruth does, just in Bethlehem rather than in Moab. And so Ruth has to say, not only am I going to go with you, I'm going to become one of your people. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Your God will be my God. I will worship God as you worship God, because that's an important part of my life. And because this is how you worship God here in this place. And so she begins to worship Yahweh. She begins to worship God in a way that is Hebrew, And so then she even has to go on and say, don't ask me to leave you again. Like Naomi has been so insistent that the girls just need to stay. And Ruth has to say, no, stop saying that, because I'm not staying.
So Ruth, starts to worship God. Is this, I mean, that was not common, right? So
Correct.
For a non-Hebrew to be worshiping a Hebrew God had to be very uncommon.
Very, very uncommon. Like even to the days of Jesus, like it is not until very like into the story of the disciples, like Peter and Cornelius in Acts 10, like God has to give Peter a dream that says, hey, stop calling these animals unclean because I made them, and stop calling people unclean because I made them. Salvation is bigger than just the Jewish people. Salvation is bigger than just the Hebrew, the Hebrew lineage. That was earth-shattering in the New Testament. That was earth-shattering to the disciples. But God's already been doing that back in the Hebrew Bible, in their history. But yeah, that was definitely very uncommon.
So that's what I was getting at. I mean, is this kind of the first indication of that?
One of, yeah, definitely one of. Like it ties back to the Joseph series, because like Potiphar was cool with Joseph worshiping God, not because Potiphar was cool with God. Potiphar was cool with the benefits of Joseph worshiping God, because that made him so financially successful, and made, by extension, Potiphar so financially successful. But this is Ruth abandoning her beliefs in order to follow what we believe as the true God. That's very different. Because even when the prophets start to rise up, they're calling their own people back to faithfulness first. Mm-hmm. Like they are demonstrating to people that were Hebrew folk that started worshiping other gods to come back, rather than, and if they had that effect of bringing people from the outside into it, cool, but that's not what they're really for. Like the prophets were being raised up to call God's own people back to faithfulness, not necessarily call other people to faithfulness. That's a great point. Good question.
So, the efforts of the apostles and Paul or the disciples and Paul and all of that, is to get everyone to come. And so that just really wasn't a goal of the Hebrew people prior to Jesus, was it?
No, not at all.
Interesting.
Not at all. They were very insular focused. Like especially in the days of Jesus, they're still reeling from the exile, and they're so focused on following God's law that they want to make sure that they have it right. Because everyone else can go to hell in a handcart as far as they're concerned, but they're going to follow the law of God because their predecessors did such a terrible job of it. And so that's where you have the hedge laws and here's the actual law, but here's the thing you can't really do that was to protect God's law. And that was their entire focus. was making sure that they were correct and had nothing to do with expanding the kingdom of God until Jesus gets on the scene.
It almost feels like we're going to protect ourselves. We're going to take care of ourselves before we take care of others.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And like there's a part of that where like we have to, I mean, this is what Paul says to one of the churches, we have to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Like we have to we have to be right with God, but what Paul and the apostles are helping us see is that to be right with God, we have to be reaching out to the next person. We have to be extending God's love. That's how that works. Those two things are tied together intrinsically, and that's what the Hebrew people did not see at the time.
Yeah.
One of the things they did not see at the time.
That's good. What else did you cut?
I think that like even in the writing process, like I don't think that I got as much into like because this is supposed to be part of our stewardship series of like how we use our time, talent, and treasure to build a legacy of faithfulness. So I didn't necessarily get as much into that as I wanted to, just because I knew what my time constraints were going to be like. And so I guess the question I would have to ask is just, as you think about the history of the church, of the Canton Church, and you know more of the history than I do because you've been here for 30 some odd years and I've been here for 3. We're getting there. But so like what are some of the decisions like that you can think back on of people really taking a leap of faith, of really stepping up into faith stepping up in their faithfulness in order to leave that legacy of faithfulness to the next generation?
Sure. Well, I jumped to building projects first. And Teresa Geiper, our treasurer, will always say this: we're always really good at building projects, right? But people have always seen the brick and mortar of our facility as a way to make sure that our church lasts a lifetime, And so I think back to the 1996 edition, the parsonage, and the parking lot, the concrete parking lot. We did that, and that was 2018, wasn't it? 19, somewhere around there.
In that ballpark, yeah.
In that ballpark. And the impact, or knowing that doing those things will have a positive impact on the future. And all 3 of those, I think, are pretty easy to see how they can have a positive impact, in the future. I mean, our parsonage was falling apart when they built this one. Lots of different things, but, even buying the whole block. At one point there was a house that we did not own at the time. We own it now. And just having a vision to see what that could become, in the future. We may not necessarily be there now in transforming that part of the block into something else, but right now it's a good ministry for us to have a house there and have someone be able to live there. You know what I mean?
It is. I mean, and because housing in Canton is such a huge issue. Like, if you're on the Canton, like the Canton Helping Canton or the Canton Pay It Forward pages, it's just like every third post is there any place in this town that's for rent? And like the fact that we have a house, like, and we have a fantastic renter, we're providing something that this community truly does have a need for, even in having that Randall house. Yeah, I think that's a huge. We may not always see that as a missional thing, but I think that it's definitely a missional thing.
Right. So yeah, those are the things that jump off the page right away.
Yeah, for sure.
Other things, I think, you mentioned the turkey supper on Sunday, or maybe you did.
That was a couple weeks ago, but yeah.
Yeah. One thing that has always, the turkey supper has been around forever. And it just seems to keep going. Now we're getting to the point where the people who run that need, are about at the age that need to be replaced at some point.
Yep.
And so it's time for someone, that next generation to step into that role of leadership. But it's something that's always been there. It's something that the community knows. It's always the Thursday prior to Thanksgiving, and will always be there for them to come and have a meal, and fellowship with people from the community. So it's always been a really good just a good outreach for our church.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And then that turns into scholarships for seniors that are heading off to school from our church. And I think that's such a cool way of being supportive and building that legacy of faithfulness to the next generation, of saying your church is behind you as you decide to extend your education beyond Canton High School.
Right.
And West Lyon High School, and Alcester Hudson High School, and we've had some different folk from that are a part of our church that don't necessarily just go to school in Canton.
That's a really good point. How about from the outside looking in?
Yeah, I just think, I think of the building projects, but I think of in terms of the decision to go from 3rd and Dakota to our current site. Like I would love to be a time traveler and be a part, because like they ended church in the old building and walked and sang and prayed to the new building, like, or to the side of the new building, or to the new building itself, I think is how that goes. Yep. But like I would have loved to been a part of that, that's a huge step of faithfulness. I mean, to go from a building that has been, we've had 2 buildings in 150 some odd year of our history of our church. We've had the building on 3rd and Dakota, which is now City Hall, and we've had our building since 1966. Like that, those are huge steps. And I so appreciate the vision and the foresight that we had, to build in that location, and then to systematically own the block as well, because it just does. I mean, we're a focal point right on 5th Street, when I have friends coming through town, where's your church? Where's your church? Just hang on Highway 18 and stay there. You'll run into it. You really, we own the block. You can't miss it, and so, yeah, that's the biggest one that comes to mind for me, because that could not have been an easy decision. I don't know our history well enough. I need to talk to your mom more about this, but like, I don't know if it was a space issue, like, or were we running out of space? Was that building, it was, about a 80-year-old building at that point in time. So I'm sure there were limitations and things that were becoming too hard to maintain, to have the vision and the foresight to really say, we're going to completely just pick up and move, and then to faithfully make that change and to be excited about it, I just think is such a really cool thing.
Our building has always been able to provide so many things to the community. It's always a space that everyone is willing or wants to use. 1, for the location, 2, for the quality of the building, 3, the size of the rooms that we have available. And I just think that's such a cool thing that we can offer that to the community. Yeah,
definitely. I just think that the hospitality that we provide as well along the way, I think that's pretty telling of who we are as a congregation.
Well, let's see. Next week would be week 3.
Yes.
The series.
Yep. And so next we are going to be talking, kind of digging into even more of the nuts and bolts of legacy. And we're just going to ask the question, how will we be remembered? And we're going to be looking at a story from the Gospel of Matthew, where it's the party at Simon's house, Simon the leper. There's a party happening, and Simon the leper is the host, and there is some scholarship that suggests that Simon is hosting this party in celebration of his healing from Jesus. And so that's how he's remembered. That is part of his legacy. And then in the midst of this gathering, a woman comes in and breaks up the alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, and the disciples are mad about it. They're mean about it. They're not kind. And so it is Judas Iscariot. I know we're all surprised. That is the most vocal opponent. And then after that, like, it goes right from this scene at Simon's house to Judas before the high priest agreeing to sell out Jesus. And like, what kind of legacy are we leaving? How is it that we want to be remembered? And we're going to be looking to the example of like what Jesus says in response to this woman doing this. Like, we don't know her name, but Jesus says, everyone in history will talk favorably about you because of what you've done for me in doing this. And then there's Judas. And those are two very stark contrasts. And so we'll be digging into the nuts and bolts of that story, the nuts and bolts of, how people remember us and how we want people to remember us. I have some pictures of some famous tombstone epitaphs to show at the start of worship. I'm pretty excited about. And then just digging into just, what that says about who we are as God's people and the legacy that we truly are leaving, because that's, at the most basic level, one of the definitions of legacy is just how people remember you. What will people say, when you're gone? And what do we say about Judas? Nothing too good. And what do we say about this woman? That she did this thing to honor Jesus and to thank Jesus, and it was over the top and it was extravagant and it was wasteful, but it didn't matter because in so doing, she proclaimed the love of God in her life. And so which example do we want to emulate, and what does that look like to emulate the right example?
Yeah.
With our time, talent, and treasure.
Sweet.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us in this week's Cut for Time podcast. Join us again next week in person at 10 a.m. at the church, on Facebook Live. We're back here for the podcast next week.
Thanks for listening to our Cut for Time conversation. Join us for worship in person or on Facebook Live Sundays at 10 o'clock Central Time. And now go in peace and serve the Lord.